feel the power of the dark crystal.
Even after conquering television with The Muppet Show, Jim Henson was still haunted.
We've reached the point where you can do almost anything that you can conceive of.
His bizarre experiment with adult puppetry had gone horribly wrong.
You're a puppet. You don't breathe, you're not alive.
But out of that failure came his darkest idea yet, without the safety of humans or a talking green frog. It was an obsession, the kind that would blur the line between genius and delusion. The Dark Crystal was supposed to be the pinnacle of everything he had ever worked for. A fantasy world unlike anything we'd ever imagined.
So we're trying to really create something that people will believe is alive.
But to share his dream of a Muppet-only fantasy with the world, Jim Henson quickly realized that he'd have to risk it all. The fame, fortune, and freedom he'd spent decades building could all vanish if his biggest gamble failed. To the world, Jim Henson's Muppet Show looked like everything he'd ever wanted. Recognition, wealth, and, most importantly, creative freedom.
I can't imagine anybody else having as much fun in their work as I do.
And all of this coming right after the embarrassment that was his short-lived adult puppet segment on Saturday Night Live.
You know, that's show business.
To say that this was all hard to imagine would be an understatement.
When the show stops, that life can't end. It's got to keep going, and it will in various and sundry forms.
The thing was, Gorch had stuck with him, not for what it ended up being, but for what it could have been. Proof that Muppets can tell deeper and more meaningful stories.
A dying race, numbly rehearsing the ancient ways in a blur of forgetfulness.
That they can inhabit an entire world filled with unlikely heroes, grotesque villains, and a type of magic that Henson had always wanted to experiment with.
Part of the desire was to create a whole new world, to start all over and design everything.
From his time at Saturday Night Live, Jim learned that he'd have to treat this world as seriously as the creatures within it, and that no other creative forces could get in the way of his team's ideas.
We know each other so well that we can kind of bounce off each other when we're working together.
But to accomplish all this, the Jim Henson Company would need to become a fantasy factory, filled with conceptual artists, creative builders, and performers. And they would need time, lots of time, to make sure that everything on screen felt integrated into a seamless reality.
We would take these character sketches to our sculptors, our designers, and they would start building this thing in 3 dimensions. And they would work with it for a while and get it to the point where we could actually operate it as a puppet.
Though these people and all of this time wouldn't be cheap. But if Jim Henson could keep the Muppet Show on top so he could reinvest those earnings, maybe his dream of a living, breathing fantasy world could finally crystallize, if it didn't break him first.
I wanted to create the world first. I wanted to start with a visual world and then have the story grow.
As Henson searched for the pieces that would bring his handmade world to life, a literal perfect storm would soon connect everything together. While traveling between England and New York, Henson came across Once Upon a Time, a collection of British fantasy art whose cover radiated the mysticism he'd been chasing.
I saw some of the work of Brian Froud, and I immediately loved it. I thought it would be the sort of thing that was just right for this particular idea, and his concepts visually were the type of thing that we could translate into 3 dimensions.
Now fully convinced, he knew Froud was the creative partner who could help define the look and spirit of his new world. But first, Jim had to convince Froud, an established artist, to join a project outside both of their comfort zones.
We had this wonderful dinner, but by the end of it, he seemed to be asking me if I would like to design a film. He somehow thought I was the man for it, but what he didn't know is that I was really keen on puppets and making things.
Their connection was immediate, but Jim still needed funding to turn their shared vision into something real. And as with so many of Jim's breakthroughs, the answer came back to the Muppets, the very creatures that had given him everything, and now would open the door to his next grand experiment.
Miss Tracy, prepare the standard rich and famous contract for Kermit the Frog and Company.
Around this time, longtime producer Lou Grade came calling with an idea to turn the success of The Muppet Show into a feature film. Jim agreed, but with one condition. If he delivered the Muppet movie, Grade would also have to back his darker fantasy project.
I put out my hand and I says, shook Jim's hand. I says, you've got a deal for 2 movies.
The deal was made. The family-friendly film would come first, and Jim's Strange New World would follow. That didn't bother Jim. He finally had the green light to start building the world he'd been dreaming about. And one of the first creatives to begin conceptual design work was none other than Brian Froud.
Jim came to visit me in Devon, and we went out for a walk, and there were twisted trees and moss, and he said he wanted the film to feel like this.
For Jim Henson, the perfect storm had just begun, and in a tiny hotel room near JFK Airport, the spark that would fuel his biggest creative risk began to materialize. Snowed in, Jim distilled years of notes and ideas into a 25-page story titled The Crystal, featuring a dying world, warring races, an unlikely hero, and a magical crystal at its center. He could feel that this was the start of something special, but to bring it to life, he'd have to step beyond his comfort zone and build a creative machine capable of turning his epic imagination into reality.
There was something about Jim that encouraged you to think you could do this.
As the Muppet movie neared completion in 1979, Jim pivoted from controlled Hollywood sets to a chaotic workshop of his own. A creative lab where artists could dream, fail, and start again.
We would build a thing, we'd put it on videotape. We usually just shot a little rough tape of it in the studio, and then we'd all look at it, talk about it a while, and then pull it all apart and start all over again.
Together with Brian Froud, he founded Jim Henson's Creature Shop, a new division devoted entirely to the crystal, pushing puppetry, effects, and design further than the Muppets ever had.
I don't know of any other place that could provide the opportunities for neat things to do, as Jim Henson would call it. He likes to say, he wants to do some neat things.
Jim Henson's dream world was finally taking shape, but that's when a new problem emerged.
For anyone who has ever dreamed of fame and fortune at the end of the rainbow, this is one of the greatest success stories of all time.
The Muppet movie premiered just a few months later and became an instant hit. The kind of runaway success that solidified Kermit as a household name.
Everybody knows them, but not me.
And turned Jim into the face behind a global brand.
The American Express card.
Don't leave home without it.
But it was a strange contradiction. The more successful Kermit became, and the more necessary that success was, the easier it was for Jim to get boxed in by this felt frog on his arm. So when Hollywood came calling for a quick Muppet sequel, forcing Jim to shift his focus, it wasn't a surprise, even if it meant his darker promises got left in the dust.
When you think of great moments in cinema, for example, Jolson sings, Garbo laughs, Barrymore talks, Kermit rides a bicycle.
The Muppet movie premiered in the summer of 1979 and became the biggest success of Jim Henson's career so far. But while the exposure and financial success certainly didn't hurt the Muppets, it began to take its toll on Henson. The more time spent performing as Kermit at award shows or guest hosting The Tonight Show, the less time he had to work with the pre-production team on The Crystal. And that's not even counting The Muppet Show's 4th season, multiple TV specials, and his ongoing work on Sesame Street.
That was great. You went to the commercial right on time. You're doing a great job as host. Isn't he doing a great job as host?
But Henson was about to get even busier. When financiers saw the Muppet movie's box office numbers, they pressed for a fast sequel, something that Jim hadn't expected, and definitely not part of his original plan. But none of that mattered. And it quickly became clear that the Crystal would have to be pushed back to make room for a second Muppet movie. The upside was that it gave Brian Froud and the Creature Shop more time to experiment and expand their world.
One day, one of our performers, who was a clown, came in with his 10-foot stilts And he was walking around the rehearsal room, and all of a sudden it dawned on us, that this could be a basis of a creature.
Another bonus was that it gave Henson the chance to step into the director's chair on a full-scale feature, something he hadn't felt ready for the first time around.
But what we've done is we've taken a lot of different techniques that from all different forms of puppetry and television, and sort of put them all together into one thing.
The downside, of course, was cost. Keeping dozens of artists at the creature shop for another year wasn't cheap, and it added another project to Henson's already crowded plate, forcing him to go straight from one film into the next. Still, if this was the path Jim Henson had to take to bring his vision to life, so be it. But it was becoming clear that to pull it off, he'd need help from one of his closest creative and kindred spirits.
Co-directing is always a slightly complicated thing. An entire film unit is not used to relating to two people, they're used to relating to one.
Just months after The Muppet Show filmed its 5th season, and only 3 months after wrapping The Great Muppet Caper, Jim Henson finally settled into the director's chair for what was now called The Dark Crystal. But he wasn't alone. Knowing the toll this creative whirlwind would take, Henson had asked his longtime collaborator Frank Oz to join him as co-director. Oz had been working with Henson for more than 15 years and had already shown interest in directing, so pairing their strengths felt like a natural fit.
It was essentially Jim's vision, but we both agreed on the overall concept. I believed in that vision, except sometimes we disagreed like crazy, which is very good. I think that's very healthy. It helps the project.
This dynamic proved critical because capturing the complex world of the Dark Crystal on camera was anything but easy.
Basically, in co-directing, we both did everything, but I think my own strength is in the visual. I like to compose camera shots and think about how the camera should move and that sort of thing. And I think Frank's strength is in character development, the personalities, the interactions, the dynamics of a scene.
Everyone shared Jim's goal of treating the creatures like real actors, with believable eye lines, convincing framing, and lighting that gave it all a living, breathing quality. All of this meant that, for nearly 5 months of filming, the crew faced endless challenges hiding the mechanics from the audience. Full-body creature suits hid performers inside and beneath the set, intricate choreography made movement harder, and the dense network of cables and monitors caused intense heat on stage.
Discomfort is something that we're all familiar with and we try to take for granted and try not to think about too much. All that counts is what's on the screen. It doesn't matter what it takes to get it there, but the characters have to move and relate in a certain way on the screen.
And for Jim, who is still performing when he wasn't directing, the pressure kept mounting. He not only had to make his living, breathing fantasy world believable, but he had to do it in a way that people actually wanted to watch. But it was those very people who would make the path ahead even more treacherous. Because despite everything he'd overcome just to get his dream in front of the camera, Jim's biggest challenge and his possible breaking point still lay ahead.
It was even hard for Jim to have fun on that set, believe me, because it was just too physically taxing. I mean, we're all just working our butts off, you know, it was just really physically taxing.
How far is too far when it comes to making a handmade fantasy world feel believable? This was a question Jim Henson became obsessed with. Push too far, and audiences might struggle to relate to this alien world and its creatures. But hold back too much, and the illusion they'd worked so hard to build could easily shatter.
You know, the little bugs that go running around on the tunnel floors. The little bugs were things that we bought in a toy store, you know, for like $1.
Should the creatures be built anatomically correct? The team decided yes. Henson's belief in immersive world building extended even to anatomy, whether or not it ever appeared on screen.
We went into a great deal more work than we probably needed to in order to have thought out the history of all of the people and the buildings and the plants. Very little of this ends up on the finished film, but we have to know it in order to believe this whole world, to get the entire thing working as a reality.
Which is why Agra was sculpted with visible nipples, and early cuts had a nude scene with Jen packing heat. Henson was also convinced that the film's divided races each needed to speak their own language, complete with subtitles. The effect was intended to stress just how far these various races had drifted apart and to enhance the impact of them eventually coming back together. It was a risk, but Henson had never doubted his audience's emotional intelligence. And it was this unwavering confidence, and also obsession, that got him and the team through this absolutely grueling production period. But it was after this 5-month filming marathon that he was confronted with his hardest decision yet. And the world was about to see just how committed with delivering a true dark fantasy world for all ages he really was.
Some of the younger members of the audience kept asking, "Mommy, what is happening?"
By the spring of 1982, the team had spent more than 4 years building the world of the Dark Crystal. But with the end finally in sight, and only months before the film's release, chaos erupted both in front of and behind the camera. Early test audiences revealed that the alien dialogue simply wasn't working, meaning new English lines had to be written to match what was already on film.
So Jim and I spent several weeks in a hotel room in Toronto in the middle of the winter, watching the movie frame by frame, counting the number of times the puppets would flap their lips so that I would be able to write new dialogue in English.
That decision about language was the clearest sign that Henson had drifted too far into fantasy and needed to step back into reality. Though at this point, his reality wasn't exactly rosy. Jim's longtime producer Lou Grade, who had originally backed the Dark Crystal, had sold his company to new owners, and they weren't pleased with what they saw. To them, distributing a dark alien puppet world looked like nothing more than a bad investment. And that skepticism would become Henson's biggest and final test.
I remember going to a screening with the executives for the first time, showing them Dark Crystal. And the movie went off. It was dead silence. The executives walked out the room, didn't say a thing to Jim or me. And he really felt lousy then. He just stood up and walked out. Not a word was spoken after 2-3 years in this movie.
He had spent years pouring every ounce of his physical and creative energy into a dark fantasy few people believed could ever work. But if this was the gamble he truly believed in, a vision that dozens of artists around the world had sacrificed so much to realize, the only way to get it across the finish line was to go all in.
What did this cost to make?
Generally, we're avoiding questions about how much a film cost. It was an expensive picture.
Because that's not what you do a film for. You know, you really don't. I mean, if you really do a film, if you want to make money, you don't do a film. Because it's always a gamble. And so you're really doing a film because it excites you, and because it's such an undertaking and you put so much into it.
During those final months of post-production, as Jim focused on polish and accessibility, he was also gathering his assets to do just that. Assets he had earned over the years, helping to launch both Sesame Street and the Muppets into the big time. And so, on December 17th, 1982, the same day the Dark Crystal widely premiered across the US, Jim Henson's company closed a deal to purchase the film, ensuring that his dark fantasy for all ages could finally be seen by everyone. The only question left was, did the audience actually care?
All in all, we spent over 5 years working on the film. It's probably the hardest thing that I've ever worked on. It was the most work, it was the most difficult, but it was the most fun, it was the most rewarding. And of all projects that I've ever worked on, it's the one that I'm the most proud of.
Jim had accomplished exactly what he'd set out to do, risking everything to build a fully realized fantasy world in the Dark Crystal. Now, both his and the project's fate was all in the hands of film critics and average moviegoers.
Riding over the countryside in Jim Henson's The Dark Crystal, the latest fantasy film from the creator of the Muppets.
Early reviews were mixed. Some critics dismissed it as the lesser of other fantasy tales, or complained it lacked the fun people expected from Henson. Others praised its ambition, artistry, and depth of storytelling. At the box office, things started slowly. Parents were unsure about the film's darker tone compared to what they normally expected from a Jim Henson production. But over the next few weeks, the Dark Crystal found its audience and even turned a small profit by the end of its run. And over time, it's become a true cult classic. For Jim, the Dark Crystal didn't break him. It became a training ground, because his biggest gamble wasn't only about one film. It was proving that his dreams could survive in a world that kept trying to box him in.
And now the prophecy is fulfilled.
With The Muppet Show having ended the previous year, and the Dark Crystal now in his rearview mirror, Jim Henson, Brian Froud, and the Creature Shop began dreaming up their next scratch-built world, one with twisting pathways, mischievous creatures, and a Goblin King, using a baby as the ultimate bargaining chip. But first, they needed to find a way to pay for it. This is part 2 of Jim Henson's journey. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, you should probably check it out. Or keep watching to see how he brought his next fantasy world to life.